In the twilight of the British Empire, the world stared at a colossus that seemed immovable, a realm painted across continents stitched together by trade routes, naval might, and a financial system that had once dictated the rhythms of global commerce. London glimmered as the beating heart of this empire, the docks roaring with goods from every direction of the globe, the Bank of England projecting an aura of omnipotent stability, and Parliament speaking confidently of Britain's eternal role as the guardian of world order. The spectacle was impressive, almost hypnotic. From India to Africa, from the Caribbean to the Middle East, millions lived under the assumption that British rule was not merely durable but inevitable. Yet behind the marble corridors and ceremonial displays, a very different reality simmered. The empire's greatness had always been supported by intricate financial scaffolding, networks of credit, global investments, foreign borrowing, and the profits extracted from colonies. As long as the machine moved smoothly, its internal weaknesses remained disguised. But by the late 19th and early 20th centuries, cracks were forming within the very mechanisms that kept Britain atop the global hierarchy. Rising competitors like Germany and the United States were challenging Britain's industrial dominance. Colonial resistance was increasing, administrative and military costs, and deeper still, a quiet but profound imbalance was growing between Britain's imperial ambitions and its actual economic capacity. The illusion persisted because institutions constructed to project strength were masterful at hiding strain. Sterling was still revered, the Royal Navy still formidable, and London financiers still commanded global respect. But the numbers behind the curtain, trade deficits, debt projections, the spiraling cost of maintaining far-flung territories, revealed an empire drifting into financial overextension. Few acknowledged it, even fewer understood its implications. For ordinary Britons, the empire meant pride. For politicians, it meant destiny. But for economists and bankers who studied the ledgers, the warning signs were unmistakable. The empire was living on borrowed time and borrowed money. Each military deployment, each colonial bureaucracy, each effort to retain global authority demanded resources Britain no longer possessed in abundance. It was a slow, quiet suffocation, masked by patriotism, tradition, and denial. And so, as the empire marched confidently into the 20th century, it carried within it a hidden flaw that no parade or speech could conceal forever, a growing dependency on debt that threatened to swallow the entire imperial structure. Something was beginning to shift underneath the surface, something subtle but profoundly dangerous. Something was horribly wrong, even if almost no one yet dared to say it aloud. To understand how the British Empire's immense facade began to crumble, we must first examine the economic foundations that once made it appear unshakable. At its height, Britain stood as the world's workshop, a nation transformed by the Industrial Revolution into a powerhouse of manufacturing, shipping, and finance. London became the epicenter of global capital flows, its banks extending credit to governments, corporations, and colonies across the world. The pound sterling functioned as the backbone of international trade, trusted because it was backed by gold and by the empire's vast reach. To many observers, this was the definition of prosperity, a system in which British goods, British currency, and British influence moved seamlessly across oceans. But prosperity, especially imperial prosperity, is often misunderstood. It rests not only on wealth generated, but on the costs required to maintain dominance. Hidden beneath Britain's impressive economic surface was a structure increasingly strained by global competition and internal imbalances. German and American industries were rising with astonishing speed, producing goods more efficiently and at lower prices. British factories, old, rigid, and slow to innovate, were gradually losing their comparative advantage. The empire's trade surplus, once a source of national pride, was starting to shrink. Meanwhile, the costs of running an empire were escalating. Britain had to fund massive armies, an unrivaled navy, sprawling colonial administrations, and the constant movement of officials, goods, and resources across continents. Securing trade routes alone consumed vast sums. From patrolling the Mediterranean to policing the Indian Ocean, Every rebellion, every border dispute, every political crisis demanded rapid deployment and rapid spending. The empire's financial obligations were no longer compensated by its economic returns. Even more perilous was Britain's growing dependence on invisible earnings, profits from overseas investments rather than domestic production. As industries at home faltered, London leaned increasingly on financial services, hoping global capital flows would mask domestic weaknesses. This shift created a dangerous imbalance, an economy that looked prosperous on paper but was vulnerable to global shocks beyond its control. Colonies, once seen as engines of wealth, were becoming more expensive to manage and less economically reliable. Nationalist movements disrupted trade, demanded reforms, and challenged the assumption that imperial authority was permanent. Administrative costs ballooned as London attempted to maintain order across territories that were no longer passive or profitable. Thus, the empire's apparent stability concealed a deepening fragility. A system that once projected endless strength was, in truth, held together by aging infrastructure, declining industries, and financial illusions. Beneath the grandeur, the pressures were mounting quietly, relentlessly, setting the stage for a crisis that would expose just how brittle Britain's economic foundations had become. The fatal economic decision that would begin the irreversible unraveling of the British Empire emerged from a moment of national pride and global crisis. The decision to finance the First World War through unprecedented borrowing. When Britain entered the conflict in 1914, its leaders believed the war would be short, decisive, and manageable within the empire's vast financial resources. But as the conflict dragged on, the reality became clear. Britain had entered an industrial war of attrition unlike anything in human history, and the cost would exceed not just expectations but the entire economic capacity of the empire. Facing a conflict that devoured money faster than it consumed men, the government abandoned centuries-old fiscal restraint. It suspended the gold standard, expanded credit, and poured staggering sums into weapons production, army mobilization, and naval supremacy. Yet even this was not enough. Britain turned outward, seeking salvation through foreign loans, especially from a rising power that had once been its colonial possession, the United States. In doing so, Britain crossed an invisible threshold. It shifted from being the world's greatest creditor to becoming its largest debtor. The decision felt logical, inevitable even, from the perspective of leaders trapped in a world war. They believed borrowing was temporary, a patriotic necessity to protect civilization and preserve imperial supremacy. Victory, they argued, would restore balance. The empire's global network, once peace returned, would repay the debts and reassert Britain's financial dominance. But in their confidence, or perhaps desperation, they failed to grasp the long-term consequences of linking the empire's survival to American credit. The war loans destroyed Britain's monetary independence, undermined the pound's status, and exposed the empire to economic vulnerabilities it had never faced before. With each new loan, each suspension of fiscal discipline, each gamble on future recovery, Britain lost a piece of its imperial autonomy. The very mechanisms that once made Britain the financial center of the world were now working against it. When peace finally arrived, the war's bill would come due, and it would mark the beginning of an economic decline that no amount of imperial pride could reverse. If you want more hidden stories of economic power, secret deals, and the financial blows that toppled nations, subscribe and let's continue the unraveling. The first cracks in Britain's imperial armor appeared almost the moment the guns of the First World War fell silent. Victory had been won, but at a price so immense that it dwarfed any triumph. Britain emerged from the war not as the confident world banker it once had been, but as a nation weighed down by debts so vast they reshaped its entire economic landscape. The numbers were staggering: billions owed to foreign creditors, especially the United States, and a domestic economy struggling to restart after years of total mobilization. What had once been the empire's greatest strength, its financial system, was now trembling under pressures it could not contain. Inflation surged in the immediate post-war years, eroding wages and savings. Industries that had expanded for wartime production were suddenly obsolete, unable to compete in peacetime markets. Coal, steel, textiles, sectors that had powered Britain's rise were falling behind more modern American and German competitors. As factories closed and wages dropped, unemployment spread through industrial regions that had once symbolized British technological supremacy. Former soldiers returning from the front found a homeland, unable to absorb them. The promise of a land fit for heroes dissolved into frustration, poverty, and disenchantment. Merchants and exporters, essential pillars of the empire's economic reach, were among the first to feel the structural shift. British goods, once dominant, were now overpriced. Due to inflation and declining productivity, trade routes disrupted by war did not recover as smoothly as London had hoped. Markets that Britain had relied upon, India, Egypt, China, were no longer passive recipients of British imports, but increasingly assertive economies charting their own paths. Meanwhile, American industry surged forward, capturing the markets Britain had assumed would always be its own. Even more destabilizing was the empire's internal pressure. Colonies were growing restless, aware that Britain's weakened economy made it less capable of enforcing authority. Nationalist movements found new confidence. In India, calls for self-rule shifted from hopeful petitions to mass movements. In Ireland, economic strain fed political rebellion. In the Middle East, British mandates demanded resources London could not easily spare. Every region required money Britain no longer had. At the same time, the global financial system was shifting beneath Britain's feet. The pound, sterling once the unquestioned king of international currency, was slowly losing its throne to the US dollar. London banks faced liquidity shortages, and the Bank of England fought desperately to defend a currency whose prestige no longer matched the empire's shrinking economic reality. These were the first visible fractures, signs that the war debt, the financial overextension, and the fading industrial edge were converging into a storm. The empire had won the war, but in doing so it had awakened a crisis that was only beginning to unfold. As the weight of economic strain deepened, the British Empire entered a period where financial pressure ignited political fury on a scale unseen in its modern history. The 1920s and 1930s became decades defined not by imperial confidence but by unrest within Britain, across its colonies, and increasingly in the global system it once commanded. Money had begun to dictate politics, and every attempt to restore the empire's former stability only served to intensify the tensions that were already simmering. One of the most consequential missteps came in 1925, when Britain made the fateful decision to return to the gold standard at its pre-war exchange rate. It was an act driven by nostalgia, by the belief that reinstating a symbol of past financial glory would magically resurrect Britain's prestige. But the world had changed. The old rate grossly overvalued, the pound making British exports impossibly expensive and forcing severe deflation onto an already weakened working class. Mines closed, factories cut wages, and resentment spread like wildfire. The working people were paying the price. For an empire desperate to cling to an illusion of monetary supremacy, the consequences erupted in 1926 with the general strike, one of the most dramatic confrontations in British labour history. Millions of workers walked out, not simply in protest of wage reductions, but in rebellion against a financial system that demanded sacrifice. While giving nothing in return, what appeared to be a domestic labour dispute was, at its core, a direct reaction to the empire's rigid and outdated economic ideology. Britain was waging a quiet war against its own workers to defend a currency standard it could no longer afford. Beyond Britain's shores, conflicts multiplied. In India, boycotts of British goods, economic resistance in its purest form, became a powerful tool for nationalist movements. In Palestine, Iraq, and Egypt, uprisings forced Britain to divert funds to military operations, stretching finances even thinner. Maintaining imperial authority required increased spending at the very moment Britain had the least capacity to do so. Every rebellion drained the treasury. Every political crackdown amplified resentment. Meanwhile, the global economy spiraled into catastrophe during the Great Depression. International trade collapsed, striking at the heart of Britain's imperial economic model. Sterling's influence weakened further, and the empire retreated into the narrow, protectionist walls of the sterling area, a desperate attempt to preserve markets through currency control. This economic retreat signaled something profound. The empire was no longer shaping the world's financial order. It was now reacting to crises it could not contain. Economic pain had transformed into political conflict, and political conflict was accelerating the empire's economic decline. The stage was set for something far more devastating than unrest, a structural collapse that would reshape Britain's place in the world forever. The collapse of the British Empire did not come with a single catastrophic moment, but with a series of blows that revealed how fatally weakened the imperial structure had become. The Second World War delivered the decisive strike. Once again, Britain entered a global conflict believing in its duty, its resilience, and its historic role as a defender of European balance. Yet beneath the speeches and the patriotic resolve lay a financial reality, even more fragile than in 1914. The empire that had barely survived the debts of the First World War was now thrust into an even larger, longer, and more mechanized conflict, one it had no economic capacity to fight alone. Very quickly, Britain found itself dependent on the United States to an extent unimaginable for an empire that once bankrolled half the world. American Lend-Lease aid kept British industry alive, fed its population, and supplied its armies. This was not partnership. It was survival purchased through dependence. By the time victory was achieved in 1945, the empire had spent its reserves, mortgaged its future, and accumulated debt so massive that its global authority had become little more than symbolism, draped over insolvency. The post-war landscape exposed this fragility with brutal clarity. Britain's gold and dollar reserves evaporated, forcing it into emergency negotiations for a loan from Washington. The conditions of that loan, convertibility, openness, and financial discipline stripped away Britain's last illusions of monetary supremacy. When sterling convertibility triggered a run on the pound in 1947, the attempt to maintain imperial influence through financial prestige finally collapsed. The pound was no longer the world's anchor. It was a currency in retreat, and so began the rapid dismantling of the empire. India and Pakistan gained independence in 1947, not simply because nationalist movements had grown powerful, but because Britain could no longer afford to govern them. The Middle East followed a similar trajectory, with mandates becoming unmanageable, burdens rather than sources of strategic strength. Africa's wave of independence in the 1950s and 1960s reflected a simple truth: the empire no longer had the economic foundations to sustain itself. The final humiliation came in 1956 with the Suez Crisis, when Britain attempted one last display of imperial resolve by seizing the canal alongside France and Israel. Militarily, Britain could act. Economically, it could not. The United States threatened to crash the pound by dumping sterling reserves unless Britain withdrew. When London capitulated, the world saw what had long been true. The empire's power had rotted from within. The British Empire did not fall by invasion or revolution. It fell because its debts, its overextension, and its refusal to confront economic reality left it defenseless in a world it no longer controlled. The aftermath of the empire's collapse reshaped Britain and the global order in ways that would echo for generations. Once the world's unrivaled financial center, London found itself grappling with a diminished role, forced to confront the reality that economic supremacy had slipped irretrievably into American hands. The old pillars of imperial wealth, sterling dominance, industrial might, colonial extraction, were gone, replaced by an economy struggling to redefine its purpose amid shortages, reconstruction costs, and deep structural weaknesses. The post-war years were marked by rationing, austerity, and a profound psychological shift. A nation long accustomed to global command was now learning to live within limits. The consequences at home were profound. Entire regions built around the industrial engine of empire, coal fields, shipyards, textile hubs, entered a long decline. Communities that had once powered British expansion now faced unemployment, shrinking wages, and fading prospects. The welfare state, born from necessity, attempted to cushion the fall, but it could not reverse the deeper erosion. Britain was no longer the economic force it had been, and no amount of social reform could recreate the wealth once generated by imperial networks. Even as living standards gradually improved, the nation moved through the second half of the 20th century with a lingering sense of loss, a quiet awareness that something immense had slipped away. Internationally, the geopolitical map realigned. The vacuum left by Britain's retreat allowed the United States and the Soviet Union to shape a new global order, turning the Cold War into the dominant narrative of the century. Former colonies, newly independent, charted uncertain paths, some toward stability, others into conflict, bearing the weight of borders and institutions shaped by imperial interests rather than local realities. The Commonwealth, meant to preserve a sense of partnership, functioned more as a nostalgic echo than a meaningful political bloc. Economically, Britain entered a prolonged struggle to maintain relevance. Multiple sterling crises, 1949, 1967 and beyond, revealed the long shadow of imperial debt and devaluation. Its eventual pivot toward Europe was less a strategic choice than an acknowledgement of necessity. The empire no longer provided markets or security. Even this shift was fraught as Britain wrestled with the tension between its imperial past and its new reduced place in the world. The long-term damage was not merely economic or political, it was psychological. A nation built on centuries of dominance now had to reimagine itself without the scaffolding of empire. Generations grew up, inheriting both the pride of imperial memory and the weight of its collapse, living in a country transformed by the very economic decisions that had once promised eternal greatness but instead ensured irreversible decline. The hidden lesson behind the fall of the British Empire is not simply that empires end or that history moves in cycles, but that economic reality is the ultimate arbiter of power. For generations, Britain believed that its prestige, its navy, its global networks and its financial institutions were unshakable pillars, structures so deeply entrenched that no external threat could topple them. Yet, what truly undermined the empire was not a foreign army nor a single catastrophic event, but a long sequence of economic misjudgments compounded by denial. Britain clung to the illusion that the rules of finance did not apply to a nation of its stature, that it could outspend, outborrow, and outmaneuver time itself. It was this refusal to accept limits that accelerated its fall. The empire's leaders failed to grasp a simple truth. Economic systems are living organisms. They must adapt to new realities, new competitors, and new global dynamics. Britain did not adapt. It held on to outdated monetary doctrines, overvalued traditions, and financial structures designed for a world that no longer existed. The decision to return to the gold standard, the refusal to modernize industry, the obsessive defense of sterling prestige, and the relentless reliance on debt-driven warfare all reflected the same deeper flaw, a belief that past glory could substitute for present strength. The final lesson is stark. Empires are not destroyed by enemies. They are undone by the economic truths they refuse to confront. Thanks for watching. Be part of our community by subscribing to this channel. Until the next video,